Hey, welcome everyone to this edition of Haberman Shorts. Today we're going to learn about the Cold War. So let's dive right in. All right, as World War II was winding down and Nazi Germany was looking like they were going to be defeated and Imperial Japan was looking like they were going to be defeated as well, the two biggest powers in the world were the United States and the Soviet Union. That's what Russia used to be called when they were communist, and we'll explain what communist means in just a moment. Anyway, they had very different visions for what would happen in Europe and Asia once Germany and Japan were hopefully defeated. Our president at that time was Harry Truman, and the Soviet Union's leader was a guy by the name of Joseph Stalin. And before the war had even ended, the Soviet Union and the United States began to disagree about what was going to happen in Europe. At the conference in Yalta in 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president before Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt unfortunately died in the middle of World War II, met with Stalin, and they looked at how they were going to carve up Europe. And frankly, in the end, they began to disagree. But first, let's talk about what is communism. So communism had a very different vision. In exchange for these economic guarantees, right? Your own house, your job, you'll never be jobless, you'll never be without health care, you'll never be homeless in the streets, your kids will always be taken care of. In exchange for the government promising you those things, you basically gave up all the liberties that we now hold dear in the United States. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, freedom to petition the government, the ability to protest or complain about anything, really. And you didn't own anything either. So if you said something that got you in trouble with the government, you could very possibly, and your family, be toast. And this is in fact what exactly happened in the Soviet Union, or what is now Russia, in the 1930s and 40s. All right, so that's communism. Well, in 1945, FDR, our president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, met with Joseph Stalin at a conference called Yalta. That's in the Crimea. It's on the Black Sea in Russia. And in any case, the idea was, how are we going to carve up Europe when we inevitably defeated Nazi Germany? So as World War II ended, we were actually allies with the Soviet Union, with Russia. So how did we end up in this intensely scary and hostile conflict with them that was called the Cold War? Well, here's what happened. Stalin intended to destroy Germans' industrial capabilities, that is, their factories, in order to prevent the country from remilitarizing, rearming with weapons, and wanted Germany to pay outrageous sums of money in war reparations. Moreover, he wanted to erect pro-Soviet governments throughout Eastern Europe to protect the Soviet Union from further invasions. And in fact, as we'll see, he was successful in erecting those governments in Bulgaria, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. He believed, Truman on the other hand, wanted the exact opposite. He believed that only a democratic and industrial Germany would provide stability in Europe and safety, peace, and prosperity. So Truman and Stalin, unable to find compromise, led those two countries, the United States and Soviet Union, into a clash of the two great powers left after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union. And that is the beginning of the Cold War. Stalin set up a pro-Soviet or pro-Russian governments throughout Eastern Europe. What happened then, Winston Churchill, who was then the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, came to Fulton, Missouri, Westminster College there in Fulton, Missouri, and he gave a famous speech in which he said that an iron curtain has descended across Europe. And we'll look at a map in just a moment and see what that iron curtain is. This led to increased tensions as well. Berlin, which was the capital in Germany at the time, was trapped in the middle of East Germany, and we'll see that. Stalin tried unsuccessfully ultimately, to drive the French, the British, and the American occupying forces in the 1950s out of the German city of Berlin by blocking highway and railway access to the city. Determined not to let the city fall, Harry Truman, our president at the time, ordered the Berlin Airlift. That is, he ordered airplanes to fly over Berlin and drop medical supplies and food to starving Berliners. This was successful, and it ultimately drove the Soviet government in Eastern Germany to end that blockade. Truman and the United States had to figure out, how do we deal with this expanding strength of the Soviet Union? Because communism was spreading throughout Eastern Europe and Asia at that time. And Truman developed what became known as the Doctrine of Containment. That is, we should not try to overthrow communism in the countries where it existed, but we should definitely try to prevent the expansion of communism beyond those boundaries wherein communism lay. This became known as the Truman Doctrine, which meant that we would support all free and democratic nations who were fighting communism. This would lead us into various wars during the Cold War. You may have heard of some of them. We had military conflicts in North Korea, in Vietnam, in Central America. And so we tried hard to prevent the spread of communism, sometimes using our armed forces to prevent that. We also developed something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This was an organization where democratic nations in Europe and North America agreed that they would provide mutual defense for each other in the case of a Soviet invasion of any member country. So in 1945, the United States was pushing from the West, quickly pushing Nazi Germany's military front back towards Berlin. Simultaneously, from the East, the Soviet Union was pushing hard, and actually they ended up beating the United States to Berlin, which was the capital of Nazi Germany. This ended up having very grave consequences after the war, because it meant that the Russians had control of Berlin's capital. And we'll see what that means in the meantime. Well, anyhow, as you're looking at this, I wonder, how would you split up Germany or decide how to rebuild Germany if you're one of the great powers who's left standing at the end of World War II? What do you think? What would the English do, the French, the Americans, the Russians? Well, let's take a look. This is exactly what happened. So you can see much of what Germany had control of at one point in time. In the East, the Russians got that. Poland got a huge chunk. And in fact, just an unrelated side note, my relatives are from this part of Saxony, which is no longer part of Germany. And my grandfather has gone back. They're looking for evidence of my family to build the family tree further back. And the Polish, for very understandable reasons, have completely wiped out all German information. So all this part was given back to Poland. This right here, the Russians controlled, and they were to help the Germans rebuild. The British got this part. The French got this, and the Americans got this. Well, the democracies, that is, France, United Kingdom, and America, within just a year or so, gave all this land back to Germany. The Russians did not. And in fact, they controlled this country called East Germany and continued to control it. And in fact, if you look at this right here, this was the city of Berlin. Berlin as well had 4 occupation zones. You had the American zone, you had the French zone, the British zone, and the Russian zone. We gave ours back to the Germans, and the French, British, and American occupation zones became known as West Germany. As you might have guessed by this point, the Russians did not give their occupation zone back to Germany, and it became known as East Berlin. So West Berlin was an island of freedom inside a larger communist sea.
When Winston Churchill talked about the Iron Curtain speech that had descended across Europe, he was not only talking about this line right here, he was also talking about a line that split the very heart of Germany, its capital, Berlin.
Cold War tensions exploded even further in 1950 when North Korea, militarily supported and funded by the Soviet Union, invaded our ally South Korea in 1950. And we were determined not to let communism spread in East Asia. So Truman quadrupled military spending and ordered General Douglas MacArthur to retake the southern half of the Korean peninsula. MacArthur did succeed in doing so, and he pushed the North Koreans almost to the Chinese border. Threatened over 1 million soldiers from communist China, China poured in over 1 million soldiers into communist North Korea, and this forced Douglas MacArthur to retreat back to the 38th parallel, which had originally divided North and South Korea.
Here you see the 4 basic phases of the Korean War. And I'd like you to notice a couple of things, first of all. Number 1, I'd like you to notice right here that in 1950, when we entered the war on South Korea's side, there almost was no South Korea left. It was really an amazing thing that happened, that we were able to reclaim the southern half of the peninsula. We had successfully at one point pushed them almost back to the Chinese border, and this is when China poured in a bunch of military forces. Now what happened though, MacArthur began to criticize Truman publicly for his unwillingness to use nuclear weapons in North Korea, and this actually would have been very unwise to use nuclear weapons there. It might have led to a global nuclear war. And Truman was forced to fire his top general for insubordination. The United Nations forces, led by our forces, remained entrenched at the 38th parallel for more than 2 years at the cost of more than 50,000 American lives. Both sides declared a ceasefire only after the new U.S. President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, threatened to use nuclear weapons in 1953. And this 38th parallel is now where the border is between North Korea and South Korea. To this day, North Korea propaganda teaches its citizens that in fact that war is still happening. And you'll learn about this later this year. North Korea lives in this parallel warped universe that's very sad. It brainwashes its citizens.
Another important aspect of the Cold War to know about is the arms race. No, by arms I don't mean the long wiggly things that protrude out of your shoulders. I mean weapons, tanks, missiles, guns, but most importantly, nuclear weapons. You see, the United States and Soviet Union were 2 of the only countries at that time that had nuclear weapons. This was a new thing in human history, and it was kind of scary for a lot of people. How would these 2 powerful nations deal with the fact that both had the ability at any point in time to completely destroy the other? Well, the arms race. In 1959, Cuba became a communist country in a revolution of its own. This was a problem for us because it was 100 miles or so off Florida's southern shore. The Soviets secretly put nuclear missiles there, we found. President Kennedy was afraid that the Soviet Union would attack the United States. He sent warships to surround Cuba. This was a very daring maneuver. He hoped a blockade would force the Soviet Union to remove its missiles. It worked. The missiles were removed. This conflict was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for 6 days, nuclear war seemed really possible. However, the Soviet Union did remove its missiles. That was one of the most intense and scariest parts of the Cold War. Perhaps ask your grandparents about it. They may remember that. On August 13th, 1961, the communist government of the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, began to build barbed wire and concrete structure splitting Berlin down the middle. They called this the Antifaschister Schutzwall, or anti-fascist bulwark, between East and West Berlin. They said that it was intended to keep the Western fascist capitalists out. In reality, it was to keep its own people in. They were building a prison for communist East Germans. West Berlin became an island in East Germany that was really to be this tiny thing on its own for the next 30 years. We're going to fast forward through the rest of the 60s and the 1970s to talk about how the Cold War ended, however. This brings us to a man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev, and another man by the name of Ronald Reagan. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in March 1985. That's a fancy way of saying he became the leader of Russia in 1985. He did two things that were new. I think he was sensing, and most historians agree with this now looking back, that Russia was falling behind the United States in economic prosperity. That means its people just were not as wealthy as Americans were. The factories weren't as good, the jobs weren't as good, the cars weren't as good, the homes weren't as good, and life was generally becoming more miserable. It was becoming harder and harder to hide that fact from Europeans and Americans. So he introduced two reforms. One of them was called perestroika, which is a restructuring of the economy, meaning allowing more free trade and more private businesses. Not a lot, but a little. And then the other was Glasnost. That was the second policy. Glasnost meant openness in Russia, meaning there was more freedom of speech. Well, this was the beginning of the end. Because how can you determine, if you're a communist government, what speech you're going to allow, like what people you're going to allow to criticize you, and what other people you are not going to allow, and you're going to crush and make them disappear? What Gorbachev ended up realizing was free speech is like a break in the dam. First, a little water comes through, but ultimately the dam bursts. The government cannot contain a little bit of criticism without letting a lot of criticism flourish. Within 5 years, Gorbachev's revolutionary program swept communist governments throughout Eastern Europe from power and brought an end to the Cold War. You either have watched or you will watch Ronald Reagan's speech outside the Berlin Wall in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev had an interesting relationship. Reagan understood that this was someone that he could work with and that might be able to help end the Soviet Union. And that was Reagan's stated goal. He wanted Russians to have a free, democratic country of their own, not communist and not oppressed. And Ronald Reagan openly demanded that the Russians tear down this wall that allow free exchange of goods and ideas between East and West. But he also demanded free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all these things. He pushed for them in Russia. He openly demanded them. And that was something that the Russian people greatly appreciated, and many times in the 1980s gave them great comfort and great hope as they themselves inside Russia were pushing for more openness and more freedoms. Well, that's the Cold War in a snapshot. I hope that's been helpful, and good luck on your Berlin Wall projects.